Sarah Martinez stood in front of her bedroom mirror and smoothed down her green dress one more time. The fabric felt soft under her fingers, and the color made her dark eyes look brighter. She had bought this dress 3 months ago for tonight's special event. Tonight was the big charity dinner at the fancy Riverside Hotel downtown. Sarah was 34 years old and taught art at Lincoln Elementary School. She loved her job and loved working with children. But tonight felt different. Tonight she would be around very rich people who gave lots of money to help kids learn music. Sarah had never been to such a fancy event before. Her friend Rebecca had invited her to come. Rebecca worked for the charity that was having the dinner. She had called Sarah 2 weeks ago and said, "You have to come with me, Sarah. It will be fun, and you might enjoy the music program they have planned." Sarah touched her hearing aids gently. She had been born deaf and had never heard a single sound in her entire life. The hearing aids helped a little bit, but mostly she read lips and used sign language to talk with people. She wondered if she would fit in with all the wealthy donors who would be there. She grabbed her small black purse and looked at herself one more time. The green dress looked nice with her black shoes. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She took a deep breath and walked to her car. The drive to the hotel took 20 minutes. Sarah could see the tall building from far away. Bright lights lit up the entrance, and many expensive cars were parked outside. Men in black suits helped people out of their cars. Sarah felt nervous as she parked her old Honda between a shiny Mercedes and a big BMW. She walked toward the hotel entrance. The doorman smiled at her and opened the heavy glass door. Inside, the lobby was more beautiful than anything Sarah had ever seen. A huge crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling. The floor was made of shiny white marble. Fresh flowers in tall vases stood on tables around the room. Sarah looked around for Rebecca. She saw many people dressed in expensive clothes. The women wore beautiful dresses and sparkly jewelry. The men wore black suits with bow ties. Everyone looked like they belonged in a movie. "Sarah, over here!" Rebecca waved from across the lobby. Sarah walked over to her friend, trying not to slip on the smooth marble floor. Rebecca looked beautiful in a blue dress. She gave Sarah a big hug. "You look amazing," Rebecca said, making sure to face Sarah so she could read her lips. "I'm so happy you came." They walked together toward the ballroom. Sarah could feel the vibrations of music and voices through the floor. Even though she could not hear the sounds, she could feel when lots of people were talking and moving around. The ballroom was even more amazing than the lobby. Round tables with white tablecloths filled the room. Each table had tall candles and fresh roses in the center. The walls were covered with gold decorations. Another huge chandelier hung over the dance floor. Rebecca led Sarah to their table near the front of the room. 6 other people were already sitting there. Rebecca introduced Sarah to everyone. There was Mr. Johnson, who owned 3 car dealerships. Mrs. Chen had started a computer company. Dr. Williams ran a big hospital. Everyone seemed very important and very rich. Sarah smiled and nodded as each person said hello. She tried to read their lips, but some people talked too fast or turned their heads away. Rebecca helped by repeating things when Sarah looked confused. On the stage at the front of the room sat a beautiful black piano. It was huge and shiny. Sarah had seen pianos like this in movies, but never in real life. A sign next to the stage said that a famous pianist would play for them tonight. Sarah felt excited about hearing the piano music. Even though she was deaf, she could feel music through vibrations. When she was little, her mother had put her hands on their old piano while playing. Sarah could feel the different notes through her fingers and body. Waiters in white jackets brought food to all the tables. Sarah tried to eat the fancy meal, but she was too nervous to have much appetite. The salad had vegetables she had never seen before. The main dish was some kind of fish with a sauce she could not identify. Around her, people were talking and laughing. Sarah watched their faces and tried to follow the conversations. Most people were talking about business or their children. Some were discussing how much money they planned to give to the charity tonight. Mrs. Chen turned to Sarah and asked, "What do you do for work, dear?" Sarah had practiced this answer many times. "I teach art to children at an elementary school," she said carefully. "How wonderful." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Do you enjoy working with kids?" "Yes, very much," Sarah replied. "Children are honest and creative. They make art with their hearts." Dr. Williams joined the conversation. "This charity helps children learn music. Do you think art and music are important for kids?" Sarah's face lit up. This was something she felt strongly about. Yes, very important. Art and music help children express their feelings. They learn to be creative and confident. She wanted to tell them that she was deaf, but that music still meant everything to her. She wanted to explain how she had learned to play piano by feeling the vibrations. But she felt too shy to share such personal information with these successful strangers. The dinner continued with more fancy food that Sarah could not pronounce. She watched the other people at her table and tried to copy how they used their forks and knives. Everything felt so formal and proper. After an hour, a woman in a red dress walked onto the stage. She had gray hair and looked very serious. Sarah could tell she was important because everyone stopped talking when she appeared. The woman took the microphone and began to speak. Sarah tried to read her lips, but the woman was too far away. Rebecca leaned over and whispered what the woman was saying. "She's talking about the charity," Rebecca explained. "They want to raise money to buy musical instruments for poor children. They also want to pay for music teachers in schools that don't have music programs." Sarah felt happy about this goal. She knew how much art and music could help children. In her own classroom, she had seen shy kids become confident through drawing and painting. She imagined music could do the same thing. The woman in red continued talking for several more minutes. Sarah watched her gesture toward the piano and then toward the audience. Everyone clapped at different times, so Sarah clapped too. As the evening went on, Sarah began to relax a little. The people at her table were kind to her. They asked about her teaching job and seemed interested in her answers. She even laughed at a few jokes that Rebecca translated for her. But Sarah still felt like an outsider looking into a world she did not understand. These people talked about buying vacation homes and sending their children to expensive schools. They discussed investments and business deals worth millions of dollars. Sarah thought about her small apartment and her old car. She thought about her students who came to school without proper art supplies. The difference between her world and this fancy ballroom felt enormous. Still, she was grateful to Rebecca for inviting her. It was interesting to see how wealthy people lived and how they helped charities. Sarah hoped the evening would raise lots of money for children who needed music in their lives. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything would change. She had no idea that she would soon be the center of attention in this room full of important people. She simply sat quietly, watched the faces around her, and waited for the famous pianist to begin the evening's entertainment. The woman in the red dress walked back to the microphone. Her name was Margaret Thompson, and she was in charge of the whole charity event. Sarah could see that Margaret looked worried about something. Her smile seemed forced, and she kept looking. at a piece of paper in her hand. Margaret tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention. The room became quieter as people stopped their conversations and turned toward the stage. Sarah felt the vibrations in the room change as voices died. "Down! Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, speaking slowly and clearly, "I have some unfortunate news to share with you tonight." Sarah leaned forward and focused on Margaret's lips. She wanted to understand what was happening. Rebecca also moved closer to help translate if needed. "Our featured pianist for this evening, David Chen, has been taken to the hospital," Margaret continued. "He became very sick with pneumonia this afternoon and cannot perform for us tonight." A wave of disappointed murmurs spread through the ballroom. Sarah could feel the change in energy as people reacted to this news. She saw faces around the room showing surprise and disappointment. Margaret held up her hand to calm the crowd. "I know many of you were looking forward to David's performance. He is one of the most talented pianists in our city, and his music always inspires our generous donors." Sarah looked around the room and saw people whispering to each other. Some shook, their heads sadly. Others looked at the beautiful piano on the stage that would now sit silent. "Without our musical program tonight," Margaret continued, "I'm worried we may not reach our fundraising goal. We hope to raise $500,000 to help children in low-income schools start music programs." The amount of money shocked Sarah. $500,000 was more money than she could imagine. That was more than she earned in 10 years of teaching. But for these wealthy people, it might be possible to raise such an amount in one evening. Mrs. Chen at Sarah's table shook her head. "That's terrible news," she said to the others. "I was really looking forward to the music. David Chen is amazing." Dr. Williams nodded in agreement. "Music is such an important part of these charity events. It helps people feel generous and connected to the cause." Mr. Johnson added, "Without the entertainment, some people might leave early. That could hurt the fundraising efforts." Sarah listened to these conversations and felt sad for Margaret and the charity. She could see how disappointed everyone was. The music was supposed to be the highlight of the evening. Rebecca turned to Sarah and began signing while also speaking quietly. "This is really bad news," she said. "The piano performance was the main reason many people bought tickets tonight. Margaret is probably panicking right now." Sarah nodded and watched Margaret continue to address the crowd. The charity organizer was trying to stay positive, but Sarah could see the stress in her face and body language. "We will still have our silent auction and our fundraising presentations," Margaret announced, "and we hope you will still consider making generous donations to help these children access music education." But Sarah could tell that the energy in the room had changed. People seemed less excited now. Some were already checking their phones, or talking about leaving early. During the next 20 minutes, Sarah watched as the evening continued without its main attraction. The silent auction had nice items like vacation packages and restaurant gift certificates, but people did not seem as interested as they probably would have been after hearing beautiful piano music. Rebecca kept translating the conversations around their table. Most people were sympathetic about the sick pianist, but they also seemed disappointed. A few mentioned that they might make smaller donations than they had originally planned. "This could be a disaster for the charity," Rebecca whispered to Sarah. "They really needed tonight to be successful. There are so many children waiting for these music programs." Sarah felt her heart sink. She thought about all the children who would miss out on learning music because of one man's illness. She knew from her own experience how much art and creativity could change a child's life. As she watched Margaret struggle to keep the event exciting, Sarah began thinking about her own relationship with music. Most people at this dinner probably did not know that a deaf person could have any connection to music at all. But Sarah's connection to music was deep and real. When she was 5 years old, right after her family learned she would never hear, her mother had started putting Sarah's hands on their old upright piano while she played simple songs. At first, Sarah just felt strange vibrations, but slowly, she began to understand that different keys made different vibrations. High notes felt light and quick. Low notes felt heavy and slow. She could feel the difference between loud and soft, fast and slow. Her mother had been patient and creative. She would play the same song over and over while Sarah felt the vibrations through her hands and body. Eventually, Sarah began to understand the patterns and rhythms of music. When Sarah was 8, her parents bought her a small keyboard. She spent hours every day feeling her way through simple songs. She could not hear the melodies, but she could feel them. The vibrations traveled through her fingers, up her arms, and into her chest. By the time she was 12, Sarah could play many songs on the piano. She had even learned to play some classical pieces by famous composers. Her music teacher was amazed at how well Sarah could play without being able to hear the notes. But Sarah had stopped performing in public when she was in high school. She felt too different from other musicians. She was tired of people staring at her and being surprised that a deaf person could play piano. Now, sitting in this fancy ballroom, Sarah watched Margaret struggle to save the charity event. She thought about all those children who needed music programs. She thought about her own students who had so few opportunities for creative expression. Rebecca suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm and began signing excitedly. "Sarah," she said, "I have an idea. What if you played the piano tonight?" Sarah's eyes went wide with shock. "What?" she signed back. "I can't do that. I haven't performed in public for years." "But you're still amazing at piano," Rebecca insisted. "I've heard you play at your apartment. You're better than most professional musicians." Sarah shook her head quickly. "These people don't know I'm deaf. They would think it's weird or feel sorry for me. I can't." Rebecca grabbed both of Sarah's hands. "Listen to me," she said seriously. "This charity needs help. Those children need help. You have a gift that could make the difference." Sarah looked around the room. She saw Margaret still trying to encourage people to bid on auction items. She saw wealthy donors checking their watches and looking bored. She thought about hundreds of children who might never get the chance to learn music. "I'm scared," Sarah signed to Rebecca. "What if I make mistakes? What if people think I'm just a publicity stunt?" Rebecca squeezed Sarah's hands tighter. "You won't make mistakes. You're talented and you've been playing piano for almost 30 years. And these people need to see that music is for everyone, including deaf people." Sarah's mind raced as she considered Rebecca's suggestion. She thought about the beautiful Steinway piano sitting empty on the stage. She thought about the disappointing evening and the money that wouldn't be raised for children. She also thought about her own fears. She had avoided public performance for so long because she was tired of being seen as different or inspirational just because she was deaf. She wanted to be seen as a musician first, not as a deaf person who could surprisingly play piano. But as she watched Margaret's continued struggles on stage, Sarah began to feel something different. Maybe this wasn't about her fears or her comfort. Maybe this was about using her abilities to help others. The classical pieces she had learned over the years were still in her muscle memory. Her fingers still knew exactly where to find each note on the keyboard. She could still feel the vibrations and rhythms that had been her guide to music for decades. "If I do this," Sarah signed to Rebecca, You have to promise me something. Don't. Tell people I'm deaf until after I play. I want them to hear the music first, not my disability. Rebecca nodded eagerly. I promise. Let me go talk to Margaret right now. As Rebecca stood up from the table, Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She had no idea if this was a good decision or a terrible mistake. She only knew that somewhere inside her the music was calling her back to the stage. The next few minutes would change not only this charity event, but Sarah's entire life. Sarah watched Rebecca walk quickly across the ballroom toward the stage. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her chest. She looked down at her hands and saw they were shaking slightly. The green dress that had made her feel confident earlier now felt too tight. Rebecca reached Margaret Thompson and began talking to her quietly near the side of the stage. Sarah could see Margaret's face change from confusion to surprise to hope. Rebecca was pointing back toward their table where Sarah sat. The people at Sarah's table noticed Rebecca talking to the charity organizer. Mrs. Chen leaned toward Sarah and asked, "Is your friend trying to help with the entertainment problem?" Sarah nodded but could not find words to explain what was happening. Her mouth felt dry and her stomach was full of butterflies. She had not felt this nervous since her first day of teaching. Dr. Williams watched Rebecca and Margaret talking. "It looks like they might have found a solution," he said with interest. Mr. Johnson added, "I hope so. This evening really needs something special to get people excited about donating again." Sarah tried to take deep breaths to calm herself. She thought about all the times she had played piano alone in her apartment. Those times felt peaceful and safe. But playing in front of 200 wealthy strangers felt completely different. She looked around the ballroom at all the well-dressed people. Most of them were still talking quietly at their tables or looking at the auction items. They had no idea that in a few minutes their evening might completely change. Margaret suddenly stepped up to the microphone again. The room began to quiet down as people turned their attention back to the stage. Sarah felt the vibrations in the floor change as conversation stopped. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said with a much brighter smile than before, "I have wonderful news. We may have found someone to provide musical entertainment for us tonight after all." A murmur of interest spread through the room. Sarah saw people sitting up straighter in their chairs and looking toward the stage with curiosity. A talented musician has graciously offered to perform for us this evening, Margaret continued. Please welcome Sarah Martinez to the stage. The sound of polite applause filled the ballroom. Sarah felt the vibrations through the floor and her chair. This was really happening. There was no turning back now. Sarah stood up slowly from her chair. Her legs felt weak and unsteady. The people at her table smiled and clapped for her. Mrs. Chen looked surprised but pleased. Dr. Williams nodded with approval. "Good luck," Mr. Johnson whispered, as Sarah stepped away from the table. Rebecca had returned and gave Sarah an encouraging smile. "You can do this," she mouthed silently. "Just remember why you're doing it." Sarah began walking across the ballroom toward the stage. The room felt enormous. Every step seemed to take forever. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her as she moved between the tables. Some people looked curious about who this unknown musician was. Others seemed skeptical that someone they had never heard of could provide quality entertainment. A few smiled politely but appeared to be reserving judgment. Sarah focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The marble floor was slippery under her black shoes, and she was careful not to trip. Her green dress swished softly as she walked. As she got closer to the stage, the piano looked bigger and more intimidating. It was a concert grand Steinway, much larger than any piano she had ever played. The black surface was so shiny, she could see the chandelier reflected in it. Sarah climbed the 3 steps up to the stage. The lights were brighter here, and she could feel their warmth on her face. Looking out at the audience from this height made the ballroom seem even more vast. Margaret met her at the piano bench and shook her hand warmly. "Thank you so much for doing this," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means to our charity." Sarah nodded and tried to smile confidently. Inside, her mind was racing with doubts. What if she forgot the music? What if her hands were too shaky to play well? What if people thought she was terrible? She sat down on the piano bench and adjusted her position. The bench was the perfect height, and the piano keys were positioned exactly right. She placed her hands lightly on the keyboard and felt the familiar smoothness of the ivory keys. The audience was watching her with polite attention. Sarah could see their faces looking up at her expectantly. Some people were still holding conversations, but most had turned toward the stage. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and tried to remember why she was doing this. She thought about the children who needed music programs. She thought about her own students who had so few opportunities for creative expression. She thought about how music had saved her during the difficult times in her life. When she opened her eyes, she felt a little calmer. She looked out at the audience and saw Rebecca giving her an encouraging thumbs up from their table. That small gesture helped Sarah feel less alone on the big stage. She placed her fingers on the keys and prepared to begin. She had decided to start with Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was a piece she had been playing for 15 years, and she knew every note by heart. But as she sat there, ready to play, Sarah realized something important. For the first time, in many years, she was not worried about being judged as a deaf person trying to play music. She was simply a musician about to share something beautiful with an audience. The room became quieter as people noticed she was about to begin. Sarah felt the change in energy through the vibrations in the floor and the piano bench. This was the moment of truth. She took one more deep breath and let her training take over. Her mother had always told her that music comes from the heart, not from the ears. Tonight, Sarah was going to let her heart speak through her fingers. The classical piece she had chosen started softly and gently. It was perfect for drawing people's attention without startling them. Sarah knew that once she began playing, the music would either capture the audience or lose them completely. As her fingers found the first notes, Sarah felt a familiar sense of peace wash over her. The vibrations traveled through the keys, into her hands, up her arms, and into her chest. She could feel every note in her body, just like she had when she was a little girl learning piano with her mother. The stage lights were warm on her face, and the beautiful piano responded perfectly to her touch. Sarah forgot about the fancy ballroom and the wealthy donors. She forgot about her fears and doubts. In this moment, there was only the music. She had no way of knowing that within seconds, every conversation in the room would stop. She had no idea that people would set down their wine glasses and turn completely toward the stage. She could not know that some people would get tears in their eyes before she finished the first section of the piece. Sarah simply played from her heart, letting the music flow through her body and out into the world. She was about to discover that when music comes from a place of pure emotion and genuine skill, it does not matter whether the musician can hear it or not. The audience was about to learn something they would never forget, that true musical talent transcends all boundaries, including the ability to hear. They were about to witness something extraordinary that would change their understanding of what music really means. As Sarah's fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, the magic began to happen. The room started to transform from a polite charity dinner into something much more powerful and moving. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade flowed from Sarah's fingers like water from a gentle stream. She had played this piece hundreds of times in the privacy of her apartment, but tonight it felt different. Tonight every vibration seemed more powerful, every note more meaningful. Sarah kept her eyes closed as she played the opening section. She could feel the music traveling through the piano, through the stage floor, and out into the ballroom. Even though she could not hear the sounds, she knew exactly what the audience was experiencing because she could feel it in her entire body. The first section of the ballade was soft and thoughtful, like someone telling a quiet story. Sarah's fingers moved with perfect precision across the keys. She had memorized not just the notes, but the exact feeling of each phrase, each pause, each gentle accent. When she opened her eyes and looked out at the audience, she was surprised by what she saw. The polite, distracted faces from before had completely changed. People were leaning forward in their chairs, their eyes fixed on her hands. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Mrs. Chen at Sarah's table had her hand over her heart, her mouth slightly open in amazement. Dr. Williams had put down his wine glass and was watching with intense concentration. Mr. Johnson, who had seemed bored earlier, was now completely focused on the stage. Sarah could see that something special was happening, but she did not fully understand the impact of her performance yet. She was too focused on the music itself to realize that she was creating something magical for the listeners. As the ballade continued, Sarah moved into the more dramatic sections of the piece. Her fingers found the darker, more intense passages that Chopin had written to express deep emotion. The music grew stronger and more passionate. The vibrations through the piano became more powerful. Sarah could feel the bass notes resonating in her chest, while the higher notes created delicate patterns she felt through her fingertips. This was the language she understood better than any spoken words. Around the ballroom, people were having experiences they had never expected. Many had come to the charity dinner out of social obligation. They planned to eat, write a check, and go home. But now they found themselves deeply moved by music in a way they had not felt in years. A woman at table 5 had tears starting to form in her eyes. She had lost her mother 6 months ago, and something about Sarah's playing reminded her of the lullabies her mother used to hum. The music was bringing back memories she thought she had buried. An older man near the back of the room was thinking about his own childhood piano lessons. He had given up music 40 years ago to focus on business. But listening to Sarah play made him remember why he had loved piano so much as a boy. Margaret Thompson stood at the side of the stage, watching the audience's reaction with amazement. In 20 years of organizing charity events, she had never seen people respond to music like this. The entire room seemed to be under a spell. Sarah continued playing, moving through the different sections of the ballade with growing confidence. She could feel that the audience was with her, following every note of the musical journey. This gave her the courage to play with even more expression and emotion. The middle section of the piece was lighter and more playful. Sarah's fingers danced across the keys with joy and energy. She could feel smiles spreading across the audience's faces, even though she could not see all of them clearly from the stage. Rebecca watched her friend with pride and amazement. She had heard Sarah play many times before, but never like this. Tonight, Sarah was not just playing notes on a piano. She was telling a story, sharing her soul, and touching every heart in the room. As Sarah moved toward the climax of the ballade, the music became more intense and dramatic. This was the section where Chopin had poured all his passion and skill as a composer. Sarah had always felt a special connection to this part of the piece. Her hands moved with incredible speed and precision through the difficult passages. The vibrations were so strong now that people sitting near the stage could feel them through the floor. The piano seemed to be singing with pure emotion. A businessman who had planned to leave early found himself unable to move from his chair. The music was speaking to something deep inside him that he had forgotten existed. He realized he had not felt this moved by anything in years. Sarah reached the most powerful moment of the ballade, where all the different musical themes came together in a stunning climax. Her whole body was involved in creating the music now. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, her face showing the intensity of what she was feeling. The audience was completely silent, except for the piano music. No one was checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors. Even the waiters had stopped moving around the room. Everyone was focused entirely on the remarkable performance happening on stage. As Sarah began the final section of the ballade, she opened her eyes again and looked out at the faces watching her. What she saw took her breath away. People were not just listening politely anymore. They were experiencing something profound. She could see tears on many faces. She could see people holding hands with their spouses or friends. She could see expressions of wonder and amazement and deep emotional connection. The music was creating something beautiful in the room that went far beyond entertainment. For the first time in her life, Sarah understood the true power of what she could do with music. She was not just a deaf person who had learned to play piano. She was a musician who could touch people's hearts and souls in ways that words never could. The final notes of the ballade were soft and gentle, like the ending of a beautiful dream. Sarah played them with perfect tenderness, letting each note fade naturally into silence. As she pressed the last key, she could feel the vibration slowly disappearing into the quiet room. For several seconds after the music ended, no one moved. The silence was complete and powerful. Sarah sat with her hands still on the keys, feeling the last tiny vibrations fade away through her fingertips. Then, like thunder after lightning, the applause began. But this was not polite charity dinner applause. This was something much more powerful and genuine. People were standing up from their chairs, clapping with real enthusiasm and emotion. Sarah felt the vibrations of the applause through the stage floor. It was stronger than any applause she had ever experienced. The whole room seemed to be shaking with appreciation and amazement. But Sarah was not finished yet. Looking out at the moved and grateful faces of the audience, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of standing up and taking a bow, she placed her hands back on the keys. She was going to play one more piece. This time, it would not be Chopin or any other famous composer. This time, she was going to play something she had written herself, a piece that told the story of her own life as a deaf person who found her voice through music. The audience quickly realized she was not done and settled back into their seats. They had no idea they were about to hear something even more special than what had come before. Sarah placed her hands back on the piano keys and took a deep breath. The piece she was about to play had never been performed for anyone except Rebecca. She had written it over many years, adding sections as her life changed and grew. She called it Silent Symphony because it told the story of finding music in a world without sound. The opening notes were different from the Chopin piece. These sounds came directly from Sarah's heart and her own experiences. The melody started very quietly, like a child trying to understand the world around her. As Sarah played her own composition, she remembered being 5 years old and feeling piano vibrations for the first time. The music reflected that sense of wonder and discovery. Her fingers created patterns that felt like a little girl's first steps into a new and amazing world. The audience sensed immediately that this music was different. This was not a famous classical piece they might recognize. This was something personal and original. They leaned forward even more, trying to understand what story the music was telling. Sarah moved into a section that represented the difficult years of her childhood. The notes became more complex and sometimes sad. This part of the song was about feeling different from other children, about struggling to communicate, about feeling left out of a hearing world. Mrs. Chen felt tears starting in her eyes again. Even though she did not know Sarah's story yet, she could hear the loneliness and struggle in the music. The piano seemed to be crying and asking questions that had no easy answers. As the piece continued, the music began to change and grow stronger. Sarah was now playing about her teenage years when she discovered that being different could also mean being special. The notes became more confident and determined. Dr. Williams found himself thinking about his own daughter, who had learning difficulties in school. The music was making him understand something about overcoming challenges that he had never felt so clearly before. Sarah played through sections that represented learning to love herself, finding her passion for teaching, and discovering that her disability did not limit her dreams. The music was full of hope and determination now. The audience was completely caught up in the musical story. Even though they did not know the specific details of Sarah's life, they could feel the universal themes of struggle, growth, and triumph that everyone could understand. Margaret Thompson watched from the side of the stage with amazement. She had organized hundreds of charity events, but she had never seen an audience react like this. People were not just listening to music, they were experiencing something that was changing them. As Sarah reached the final sections of Silent Symphony, the music became joyful and celebratory. This was about finding her true calling as a teacher, about discovering that her unique perspective made her a better educator, about understanding that her music could touch people's hearts. The last part of the piece was the most beautiful. It represented Sarah's realization that silence was not empty. It was full of vibrations, feelings, and connections that most people never noticed. The music showed how she had learned to hear the world through her hands, her heart, and her soul. When Sarah played the final notes of her composition, she kept her hands on the keys for a long moment. She could feel the vibrations fading slowly into perfect silence. For the first time in years, she felt completely at peace with who she was. The silence that followed lasted even longer than after the Chopin piece. The audience needed time to process what they had just experienced. Many people were crying openly now, not from sadness, but from being deeply moved by something beautiful and real. Then the applause started again, but this time it was different. People were not just clapping, they were standing and cheering. Sarah felt the vibrations through her whole body as 200 people showed their appreciation with genuine enthusiasm. But the evening was not over yet. Margaret Thompson walked to the microphone with tears in her own eyes. She looked out at the audience and then back at Sarah, who was still sitting at the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I need to tell you something very important about the remarkable woman who just performed for us." Sarah saw Margaret speaking but could not read her lips from where she was sitting. She felt nervous about what Margaret might say. She had wanted the music to speak first, before people knew about her deafness. Sarah Martinez, our wonderful pianist tonight, has been completely deaf since birth, Margaret announced. Every note you just heard came from her heart, her training, and her incredible talent, but not from her ears. A gasp went through the room as people realized what they had just witnessed. The applause became even stronger and more emotional. People were crying and laughing at the same time, amazed by what they had experienced. Mrs. Chen turned to the others at her table with tears streaming down her face. "That was the most beautiful music I have ever heard in my life," she said. And she felt every note instead of hearing it. Dr. Williams was shaking his head in wonder. "I had no idea that was possible," he said. "She played with more emotion and skill than most professional musicians I've heard." Mr. Johnson stood up and started clapping again. "That woman is incredible," he said loudly. "She just taught us all something about what human beings can accomplish." The standing ovation continued for several minutes. Sarah finally stood up from the piano bench and faced the audience. She had never felt so appreciated and accepted in her entire life. Rebecca rushed up to the stage and hugged her friend tightly. "You were amazing," she signed while saying the words aloud. "You just changed everyone's life in this room." Margaret returned to the microphone as the applause finally began to die down. "As you can imagine," she said, "this evening has become much more than we ever expected. Sarah's performance has shown us what is possible when we give children access to music education." She paused and looked around the room at faces that were still showing amazement and emotion. "Because of what we have experienced tonight, I am announcing a new goal for our fundraising. Instead of $500,000, we are now hoping to raise $1 million. The audience erupted in applause again. People were reaching for their checkbooks and phones to make donations. The energy in the room was electric with generosity and excitement. Over the next hour, something magical happened. Donations poured in far beyond anything the charity had ever received. People gave not just money, but promises to volunteer and help spread the word about music education. Several donors specifically requested that part of their money go toward creating music programs for deaf and hard-of-hearing children. Sarah's performance had opened their eyes to possibilities they had never considered. By the end of the evening, the charity had raised over $800,000, more than they had ever collected in a single event. But more important than the money was the change in people's understanding of what music could mean. 3 months later, Sarah's life had completely changed. The video of her performance had been shared millions of times on social media. She received offers to perform at concert halls around the world. But the opportunity that meant the most to her was the job offer from the Children's Music Foundation. They wanted her to become their director of inclusive music programs, traveling to schools, and helping other deaf and disabled children discover the joy of music. Sarah accepted the job and left her teaching position. Her new work allowed her to help hundreds of children who had been told they could not participate in music because of their disabilities. She developed new methods for teaching music to deaf students, using vibrations, visual cues, and technology to make music accessible to everyone. Her programs became models that were copied by schools across the country. Most importantly, Sarah's story inspired thousands of people with disabilities to pursue their dreams. Her performance that night proved that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle. The charity gala had started as just another fundraising dinner. But because one woman was brave enough to share her gift, it became a night that changed lives, broke down barriers, and showed the world that music truly is a universal language that everyone can speak. Sarah never again doubted that she belonged in the world of music. She had learned that her deafness was not something that limited her music. It was something that made her music unique and powerful, and that lesson was a gift she would spend the rest of her life sharing with others.